Hérna.
Bortinum?
Já, og skjáarpan. Já, komið í sæl fyrir ykkur bara hjertalega velkomin hérna á Málstofa eða Málþing sem að Kennslumiðstöð Háskóla Íslands heldur í samstarfi kennslusvið og kennslumálanefnd Háskólaráðs. Og við erum búin að vera hérna nokkur í morgun á áhugaverðu verkfæri námsmat, verðum áður alveg óskaplega prófum ýmislegt í þeim efnum. En núna eftir hádegi þá dagskráin okkar þessi að Guðrún Geirsdóttir formaður kennslumálanefndar ætlar að setja þessa ráðstefnu og síðan erum við með sérstaklega ánægja að vera með góðan gest frá Oxford Brookes Háskóla sem ég mun þá bara kynna sérstaklega. Að loknum hans erindi þá kaffið, það kaffi alltaf bara hérna frammi til þess að vilja og þá koma eftir kaffið eru í boði hérna 9 málstofur og líka málstofur sem eru aldrei að vissi hvað þau eru. Ég var í Harvard eða Stanford í morgun en það líka kunskap, þannig að það hérna bara hægði og í umræðum með samnefndum að vestan í morgun að við líka að fá Háskóla Íslands sem að starfið að koma í morgun. Og þeir til að koma til hókundu bestu að ákveða með góða í kennslu og það námsmat afskaplega verulegur þáttur sem skiptir máli námsmynda. Þannig að ég byrjuði námsmynda Sigur Jón en ég hættur að fýta að setja þetta mál.
Góðir gestir, þegar ég var í skóla, þá hélt ég að kennurum hlyti að þykja gaman að leggja fyrir próf og fara yfir þau. Einhvern veginn voru próf og útkoma úr þeim svo þrungin merkingu og spennu að mér fannst þetta hljóta að vera eftirsóknarverður hluti af eftirsóknarverðu starfi kennarans. Ekki man ég eftir því að hugsa með mér að það veri erfitt að búa til sanngjörn próf, eða þá að við gerð og yfirferð prófa stæðu kennarar frammi fyrir röð af erfiðum álitamálum og bunkum af frekar illa stíluðum litteratúr, sem þyrfti að afgreiða á skemmtilegasta tíma ársins jólaleytið og á þeim fallegasta þegar vorið að koma. Ég minnist á þennan barnaskap minn vegna þess að þegar kemur að því lífi hvers kennara að sjá námsmat og semja sín fyrstu próf, þá undirbúningur til þess oftast fólkin í því einu að hafa tekið próf sjálfur og velti fyrir sér hvernig þau voru búin til. Og hafa jafnvel hugsað með sér mikið einstaklega hlýtur það að vera gaman að búa til próf. Venjulegur háskólakennari sérfræðingur á sínu sviði og réttilega falið vald til að meta árangur nemenda sinna. Þeir sem gera háskólakennslu á lífsstarfi þurfa því að sinna námsmati, þeir verða að búa til próf aftur og aftur og þeir verða smám saman vanir á því sviði, finna hagstæðar leiðir, góðar rútínur og heppilegan vanagang, en fáum kennurum þykir þetta skemmtilegasti hluti starfsins en mikilvægur hann. Góður kennari kann sitt fag, glæðir áhuga nemenda á því og verkstýrir þeim sem hann kennir, þannig þeir læri nóg, en hann þarf líka að votta að þeir séu búnir að læra það sem þeir eiga að læra. Námsmat verður að vera með þeim hætti að það gefi til kynna kröfur og mæli þær með sanngjörnum hætti. Við mæli hvernig nemendum hefur tekist að uppfylla kröfurnar og það þarf að votta þá færni sem náðst hefur. Það má ekki yfirgnæfa allt annað í náminu, verða einhvers konar aðalmarkmið þess, en það má heldur ekki koðna niður í léttúð og leiðundum, það verður að standa fyrir sínu. Og það alveg óraunhæfur draumur að þetta geti orðið eitthvað allt öðruvísi, að matshlutverk kennara leysist einhvern veginn upp. Námsmat af einhverju tagi svo til óumflýjanlegur hluti af störfum háskólakennarum allan heim. Sums staðar taka aðstoðamenn, ytri prófdómarar eða einhvers konar sérstakar aðferðir hluta þungans, en meginreglan sú að próf af einhverju tagi hafa verið og verða hluti af veruleika háskólakennara, verkefnum og hlutverki háskólakennara. Við verðum því að sinna því og það óskynsamlegt að ætla kennurum að eiga við námsmat algjörlega hverjum í sínu horni. Sumir hafa notið einhverja þjálfunar í framhaldsnámi sínu í því að búa til próf eða meta árangur nemenda, en jafnalgengt að fólk hafi lítið að styðjast við nema eigin reynslu. Það því eðlilegt að háskóli standi fyrir fræðslu og umræðu námsmat í sínum röðum, þar sem fólk getur aukið þekkingu sína, miðlað öðrum, bætt námsmat og prófahald í sameiningu. Auðvitað væri ágætt ef að allir háskólakennarar hefðu að baki sérstakt nám í gerð sanngjarnra, skilvirkra og traustra prófa. Og háskólinn hlýtur að gefa kennurum sínum kost á margvíslegri fræðslu og þjálfun til prófagerðar. En allsherjarþjálfun, einhver ein allsherjarþjálfun sem allir skulu skikkaðir í, hún leysir ekki vandann. Það er ólíklegt að einhver ein prósess gildi í öllum deildum eða fyrir alla karaktera. Nú stundir er höfuðatriði í kennslunni sem fer fram í deildum, nú er höfuðatriði að mínu mati að í þeirri kennslu sem fer fram í deildum skólans sé vakandi og stöðugt starf við þróun námsmats. Það á að vera virkur hluti af háskólastarfi að veita nýjum kennurum stuðningi í því efni, efla þá sem eldri eru og það þarf að efla áhuga menna á því að læra af öðrum, bæði þeim sem nýir eru og þeim sem eru eldri, varðveita hefðir sem hafa reynst vel og leita úrbóta þar sem þeirra er þörf. Miðlæg stjórnsýsla, kennslumiðstöð, kennslumálanefnd eða önnur þvílík apparöt geta átt aðild að slíku starfi og það eru auðvitað til hagnýt fræði námsmat sem kennarar skólans verða að hafa aðgang og nýta sér, en það er að mínu viti höfuðatriði að háskólakennarar ákveði sjálfur hvernig námsmati skuli beitt í þeirra fagi og hafi lokaorðið gerð prófana. Þeir eiga að taka leiðbeiningum og þiggja ráð, en prófagerð á líka að vera hluti af fagmennsku þeirra, ekki aðskilin bálkur ítarlegra reglna eða einhverja sérúrræða. Stóra málið er því að í skólanum sé vakandi áhuga á námsmati og hagfelldri þróun í þeim efnum og það kemur okkur öllum við hvernig það fer fram og slíkan áhuga þarf að efla. Námsmat og próf gildir það sama og kennslu, það er engin loka formúla og ég held að í Háskóla Íslands sé mikilvægt núna að efla þennan virka vettvang þar sem við lærum hvert af öðrum, tökum okkur saman að læra af völdum sérfræðingum og tökum þessi mál alvarlega. Í þessum anda er þetta þing hér námsmat haldið. Við höfum fengið til liðs við okkur kunnan fyrirlesara, Chris Röst, sem er sjóðfróður hagnýt ráð til þess að meta námsmat og síðan eru skipulagðar ólíkar málstofur til að fræðast og skiptast á skoðunum á fjölbreyttum vettvangi. Hér er því ekki að hefjast strangt námskeið til að brautskrá sérfræðinga, heldur vettvangur samtals og samræðu sem er dæmi þá umræðu sem þegar fer fram í skólanum og vonandi vísir að eflingu slíkrar umræðu og áhuga á þessum málum hjá kennurum í skólanum öllum. Hér er því ekki átaksverkefni að fara af stað. Það er engin vá fyrir dyrum sem að þarf að vinda bráðan bug að leysa. Málin eru í tiltölulega góðu lagi, en það er sífellt verkefni hjá góðum háskóla að sinna námsmati og það er áreiðanlega hraustleikamerki að í skólanum fari fram umræða þessu tagi. Ég vil í þessu sambandi þakka ykkur sem hér leggið lóð á þessa vogarskál og kannski er ekki óviðeigandi að minnast á þá velþekktu þversögn að á stefnur og þing kennslu vantar marga sem mest gagn hefur það þáttöku. Sannfæringu minni að góð kennsla mótist ekki síður af hefð og menningu heldur en á ábúðamiklum reglugerðum fylgir eitt hagnýtt ráð. Við eigum að kappkosta að umræða kennslu, þjálfun og samvinna kennslu fái það orðspor að hún geri gagn. Auðveldi manni kennslu gera hana góða og skemmtilegri. Við eigum ekki að vísa vinum okkar á gagnslaust námskeið eða krefja þá afplánun á slíkum þingum. Við eigum að efla og móta leiðir sem eru gagnlegar og þá mun ekki skorta þátttakendur og þá munu skrá sig til leiks þeir sem eru þurfandi og fróðleiksfúsir. Þetta þing er hugsað sem lóð á þessa vogarskál samræðu. Ég vona að þingi verði til gagns og efli áhuga okkar á þessu málum. Takk fyrir.
Ég ætla að kynna Chris Röst á íslensku. Hann verður bara treyta hér, ég sé ekki að ljúga með það. En Chris Röst er sem sagt sérfræðingur, er stjórnandi Kennslumiðstöð við Oxford Brookes Háskóla og hefur sérstaklega lagt sig eftir að skoða og fara með námsmat. Í ljósi þess að námsmat sé afar mikilvægur þáttur í skólastarfi og hefur stjórnað mjög mikið því hvernig nemendur okkar bera sig að nám. Við þekkjum það þegar við stöndum og höldum fyrirlestra sem eru stórfenglegir og svo réttir einhver nemandi upp hönd og segir, en kemur þetta á prófinu? Og ef maður alfast til að segja nei, þá sér maður svona hennunar leka úr höndunum á hann aftur og það ætlar enginn að læra þetta. Þannig að námsmati afar stór þáttur í námi nemenda. En Chris Rösk, fyrir utan að vera stjórnandi kennslumiðstöðvar Oxford Brookes Háskóla, þá starfar hann líka við, svona fulltrúi við 2 Center for Excellence við 2 háskóla í Bretlandi sem sérhæfðir í að skoða námsmat. Þannig það okkur mikið fengur og afskaplega klöðu á mig þegar hann tók vel í það að koma hingað og halda þetta erindi. And I'm sorry, Chris Röst, I've been speaking only fondly and nicely about you in Icelandic.
I believe you.
And we're just very happy again to have you here and that you could take some time off from your work to come and inform us a bit about the importance of assessment.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. My first ever trip to Iceland, so thank you for that opportunity. You clearly have a very exciting program this afternoon. I'm only too sorry I can't stay to come to some of the sessions. In fixing the date for this, it just so happens I've got something very important tomorrow that I have to be back in the UK for, so I can't stay, which is a shame. My flight's at 5, there's a taxi going to be waiting for me, so I'm flying away before you can get hold of me after this. So, but thank you. I have no idea what was said before, so I just thought I'd clarify. I am from the other university in Oxford, the one you haven't heard of, okay? It's not the same university. In thinking about this afternoon and what to say, you've got, as I've said, you've got a clearly very exciting program ahead of you. It seemed to me it might be worthwhile, therefore, in an opening presentation like this, to think about what the literature says, to behave like good academics, to think in a scholarly way, and to actually ask ourselves or reflect on what does the literature around learning and teaching say, and what can we take from that in terms of its implications for assessment and our assessment practice. And I would hope that much of this is not going to be new to you. I would hope that this is very much for many of you revision and an opportunity just to do what I've said, to reflect on your practice against what the literature says or suggests good practice ought to be. And obviously I've not included everything. We've only got, I'm going to try and aim for about 50 minutes and leave some time for questions, and there'll be a little break in the middle for you to do something. So that's the plan. If you go to the literature, you don't need to look very hard to find quotes like these about the importance of assessment and its effect on student learning. It's at the heart of the experience, say Brown and Knight. Ramsden, it is the curriculum. Whatever we think we're teaching, as far as our students are concerned, Ramsden says, if they know what the assessment is, they pretty much think they know what the course is meant to be about. It is the curriculum. And to be fair to our students, that's not that unreasonable, is it? If we have sent them the message by choosing what we're going to assess, we have sent them a message that that is what we think's important. And it seems to me it's vitally important, therefore, that we do know what is important on our course, and we make sure that these two things line up, that we really are assessing the things that are important. Because as students, certainly in the UK, become increasingly strategic, increasingly our full-time students are part-time really, they're only doing the things they know they need to do for assessment. And that links me to the last quote here, which out of the three, I think for me is the most important. And not just the last quote, but the last line of the last quote. if you want to change student learning and the way students approach their learning, the single most powerful lever we probably have is to change the assessment process. Because whatever our assessment mechanism is, it's having an effect on the approach our students take. And people like David Bowd in Australia have written quite a lot about this. It may not be the effect you actually want. I'll give you an example. I'm sure this doesn't happen anywhere in Iceland, but sadly, there are places in the UK. An exam, a course where the only assessment is an exam at the end. And the exam is structured as follows, and there'll be this sort of rubric at the beginning of the exam. This exam is in 3 sections. You must answer 3 questions. These questions must come from at least 2 of the 3 sections. Okay? Now, I'm sure you don't do things like this here in Iceland, do you? But we do, unfortunately, in the UK. If you are a student on that course, week 1, and you find out that's how the assessment works on this course, what's the first thing that's going to go through your head? Can I skip? Yes. Can I skip a section? Yes? Well, you can. So the question's going to be not can I, which section, isn't it? Yeah. So here we are in week 1, and the first thing you're going to choose is which third of the syllabus not to cover. Yeah? Is this the effect you wanted on your students if you designed this course? I think probably not. When are you going to start doing any work on this course? At the end, yes. And how close to the end will depend on how brave you are, or how clever you are maybe, or a bit of both. How many topics will you revise? How many topics will you revise? 2? You're a very brave student, but you're right. Yeah. I mean, the nervous ones amongst you, I was expecting to say maybe 4, the SWATs, those of you who are really good students. 4 or 3, 3's getting a bit risky, but actually, you probably can get away with 2, can't you? If you do a bit of question spotting, looking at previous exam papers, if you can work out what's likely to come up, providing you can do 2 really good answers, and then just write something for the 3rd one, you'll probably pass. Yeah? You will. And the students know that. They know that. Well, they work it out pretty quickly. Okay, so is that the effect you want on your students? Is that the behaviour you want your students to exhibit? If you've written somewhere in your course documentation, we want the students to read widely around the subject, it's not going to happen, is it? If you want your students working week on week, coming to your lectures and really thinking about them, it's not likely to happen. They're not going to do much work until 1 or 2 weeks before the exam. So whatever assessment you choose to have is going to have an effect. The key question is it the one you want? And if it's not, well then how should we change it? And that for me I think is the most important thing I'd want to say all afternoon. We need to be strategic. We need to constantly ask ourselves, if I do that, what effect does it have? And is it the effect I want? Okay. We've all been there, haven't we? We've all been there. Sure. It stopped. Now, I don't know, as I said, this is my first trip, I don't know much about the situation here, so I don't know the degree to which you have the same problems that we have. But it's interesting that in the UK there is a growing realization that in the system at large we do have very serious problems with assessment. And the evidence for this comes from a whole range of places. We have a body called the Quality Assurance Agency, that's what those letters stand for, the Quality Assurance Agency, and they come in and they look at courses and they're meant to make sure that we have quality across our universities. And if you look at the reviews they have written over the last 10 years or so, the thing which almost always they are most critical about is assessment practice. More recently, we've now started having a thing called the National Student Satisfaction Survey. And this is students after they have left and qualified. They are surveyed for their opinion. And it's been going for 3 years. And just like the QAA subject reviews, for all of those 3 years, the thing that students are most critical about is assessment. They generally think the teaching's all right. They're quite generous, in fact, I think, about the quality of the teaching and the experience they get. But the thing they are by far and away the most critical of is assessment, and within that is the issue of feedback. How much feedback they get, how much information they get on their learning, on their progress. Those are the things they're critical of. And given those first two statements there, it's not surprising that numerous people have written about this problem. Peter Knight, the recently late Peter Knight, calling it the Achilles heel of quality, or in one of his other writings, saying that our practices are in disarray. Phil Race, it's broken, he said, and a little more measured, but never, as you'd expect from it if you know Mance York, nevertheless Mance York saying there's considerable scope for professional development in this area. So slightly more reserved, coded statement there. So certainly in the UK, we know it's important, but we also know we've got a problem. We're not doing it very well. The 5 areas from the literature that I've chosen to look at are these. And the good news, I think, is that the literature is amazingly consistent. I've arbitrarily almost separated it out in these 5 areas, but in fact, as we go through, you'll see an amazing amount of overlap, and it gets to the point of repetition of some of the ideas. As I say, it's very consistent, the message. If we start with constructive alignment, I don't know how many of you have come across this phrase. If you haven't, I'll explain what it is in a minute. I'm sure some of you have. The idea of constructive alignment relates to the issue of validity. What do we mean by validity? Well, are we really assessing what we claim we're assessing, I guess? And this, as with other areas of assessment, has come in for a fair amount of criticism in the literature. I chose these quotes, amongst other reasons, to illustrate that this isn't just a UK problem. The first quote, Tom Angelo, there is talking about the United States. So Angelo, 10 years ago now, very critical about what was going on in the States. A bit longer ago, my ex-boss, Graham Gibbs in the UK, being critical about the British system. And in particular, that final point there, that whatever we say we're doing, all too often we're in danger that we're really only assessing students' abilities to memorize. Just because you have an exam question that has the phrase analyze and evaluate the difference between X and Y, whatever X and Y may be, doesn't mean necessarily, does it, that we're assessing the student's ability to analyze and evaluate. It might do if you've given them new data, if you've given them a new case study, If you've given them a different situation to any they've seen before, well then maybe we are. But if they can answer this question on the basis of their notes from the lecture you gave 3 weeks ago and reading chapter 3 in the textbook, you haven't, have you? You've assessed something else, a number of other things. You've assessed their ability to question spot, possibly. You've assessed their ability to put sentences together into some structure. You've assessed their ability to memorize to some degree. But you couldn't in any way say you know whether this student can analyze and evaluate. You've no way of knowing if they can answer on those grounds. And I think that's the issue here. And I think all too often we kid ourselves. We think we're assessing certain things because we use the right words. But I question whether we are. I'd also question whether traditional forms of assessment are the best forms of assessment to assess certain things anyway. I hope this is so ludicrous you'll all agree with me. If you were going to assess how student nurses give injections and whether they can give injections safely, I hope you'd all agree we wouldn't set them a 2,000-word essay on how to give injections. Yeah, I see some nods. I mean, I hope we'd all agree that that would be a bit silly. I fear, there possibly is somewhere that actually does that, but I hope not. But I think sometimes we're in danger of doing something nearly as silly as that. Yeah? Are we really getting to the bottom of whether somebody can do something by getting them to write a fairly traditional answer in an exam? Is that the best way of finding out? Worryingly, I used that example a few months ago in a session, and there was someone there who teaches medics, and he said, we do that lots when we train medics. They write lots of essays about how to do things. And that didn't give me much comfort about doctors, but there we go. Constructive alignment then, what is it? A phrase coined by John Biggs in 1999, and there in one sentence is what is constructive alignment. You can read it as well as I can. So, if we were to paraphrase this, what does it say? Well, it says we ought to have clear learning outcomes. He uses objectives. I'd prefer to use outcomes. We ought to have clear learning outcomes. What do we want the student to be able to do at the end of this course that they couldn't do at the beginning? And we ought to be able to answer that, or we shouldn't be teaching the course, in my view. So we need clear learning outcomes. We then need to think about what's the most sensible way of teaching our students to get to those outcomes. And then finally, how will we assess them? Well, we'll see if they can demonstrate the outcomes or not. And these three things ought to line up, they ought to be explicit, it ought to be transparent, and that's what he means by a constructively aligned system. And that basically gives us this model of course design. Now, I don't know about you, but when I say it like that, I always think this sounds pretty much like common sense. It seems to me, this is not startling. But nevertheless, John Biggs has certainly sold lots of books. It's a phrase that's being used, so maybe this sense hasn't been that common. So, as the first of my checklist here, I'd urge you to be thinking, how constructively aligned are your courses? Is the way you go about structuring your teaching the best way of getting your students to the outcomes? And most important, given the subject for today, are the ways we're assessing our students the best ways of assessing whether those outcomes have been met or not? And are we validly assessing whether those outcomes have been met or not? The second of my areas from the literature are these 7 principles, and not all of them are directly involved with assessment. They are generally 7 principles for good practice in teaching and learning in higher education. If this was an American audience, it's the one piece of literature I'd feel very confident everybody would know. It came out of a very large meta-study funded by a number of charities some while ago. And it was basically, can you go to the literature and put into easily accessible language some key guidance for teachers and universities? And this is what they came up with. That good practice should encourage student-staff contact, encourage cooperation amongst students, encourage active learning, and that's something that recurs and recurs in the literature. And here's one that is clearly about assessment: gives prompt feedback. And the literature is very clear that prompt means prompt. It means very quickly. It would seem that feedback has a very short shelf life. The most wonderful, detailed, individualized feedback 3 or 4 weeks after the student's done the work has almost certainly been a waste of your time. They will have moved on. They won't be interested unless you can build in a reason, unless this work is going to link to the next piece of work in some fairly clear and articulated way. Unless they've got a reason for wanting to read this feedback, they're not going to bother. Feedback needs to be very quick, and as I've said, we know in the UK we're very bad at this. Good practice emphasizes time on task. Students can't learn unless they spend sufficient time on the things we want them to learn. And clearly one way we know of making students do the work is for it to be assessed. And I'm linking this back to what I said earlier. Are we sending the right messages? Are we assessing the most important things? Because the things we assess are the things that the students will spend time on. So for God's sake, let's make sure that the message we're sending is making them spend the time on the right bits of the course, the right and most important things. I think this is a very important one about assessment too, that we should communicate high expectations. In the UK, we've had a commitment to widen higher education. Our government's committed to 50% of school leavers going to higher education, and I think we've now got to somewhere about 45, but we're striving for 50. That's the government target. That means that students who previously didn't come to university, who maybe don't come with quite the same sets of skills as we might have previously expected, are now coming to university. And that brings with it certain issues and problems. But what this principle here says is that we don't do those students any favours if we lower our expectations. If we have low expectations, all the evidence from the research is our students will happily live down to those expectations. Very, very happily indeed. If you want them to reach a certain standard, we need to communicate that standard clearly. Now, clearly that's an issue and a problem if students are a little weaker. It means that we've got to work that much harder at giving them support, at skills development, awful bit of jargon in the literature, scaffolding the learning. I don't like that, but I can't think of a better alternative. So we need clearly to do certain things for those students, but lowering expectations is not one of them. we need to respect diverse talents and ways of learning. What's the implication here for assessment? I think there is one. I think it's about choice. Do the students have to all do the same thing for the assessment? Now, the answer might be yes. I mean, maybe there is only one way we can safely test whether nursing students can give injections. And, you know, it's tried and tested and it's the best way. And so, fair enough. But is that always the case? Does everybody have to write a 3,000-word essay or whatever? Or could they do something different and still demonstrate the learning outcomes? Could they make a video? Could they create a sculpture, do a play, draw a poster? And if so, why not? If we're about respecting diversity and different ways of learning. And in fact, that links back to the importance of having clear learning outcomes. If we have very clear learning outcomes, it seems to me that gives us some liberty to have different ways of students demonstrating them. If we're very hazy about what it is we want students to learn anyway, it's much harder, it seems to me, to give choice and for that to remain fair and equitable. So, 7 principles, not all about assessment, but at least 4 of them, I think, very much so. The third of my 5 areas, and you'll be pleased to know I'm going to briefly stop after this and get you to talk to each other, I think you've probably come across before. I hope this is revision for many of you anyway. What this literature says is that students can adopt different approaches to their learning. And the crucially important word here is approach. This is not about ability. This is not saying that there are some students who are one and some students who are the other. It's not saying that. What it's saying is that students can and will choose between different approaches. And in some cases that may be an explicit choice, in some cases it may be a more implicit choice. But they will move between these different approaches. What are these approaches? Well, the names pretty much give it away, but a surface approach is this. Basically, the student doesn't really care about understanding what they're learning. They're certainly not worried about how it fits with other things they've learned. All it is really about is doing whatever it takes to get through the assessment task. The deep approach, as you'd expect, is pretty much the opposite. The deep approach is about wanting to really understand. It's about wanting to make connections. It's about wanting to fit this into the other things I have already learnt, seeing how it fits with the disciplinary landscape. How does this link to other courses I'm taking and so on. And I personally think that there may be a few exceptional, I don't know, service courses in, word processing or something, where it's not so important. But it seems to me, fundamentally, I would have thought that the deep approach is what higher education is about. It seems to me it's about partly what makes higher education higher, is surely that we want our students to take that deep approach. if your students take a surface approach, it's bad news, basically. And what the literature says is that there are certain course characteristics which are likely to encourage it. Now, this is not wonderfully, guaranteed. It's not hugely scientific. It's not saying there is a direct correlation and that if you do this, it will definitely result in every single student taking a surface approach. But what it says is there is very good evidence that the more of these, I won't embarrass you by asking you to put your hands up, but as you go through this list, the more of these that you are mentally ticking as true for your course, then the more chance your course is encouraging more of your students to take a surface approach. That's what it's saying. Even if you did all of these things, there's probably at least one very keen, probably mature student who will still take a deep approach. You won't stop them. But the literature says the more of these, the more chance, more students surface approach. And again, I don't think if you look at that list it's very surprising, because essentially, if this is the type of course you are offering, it's essentially about survival on the part of the student. They haven't got the time in this to worry about understanding. They haven't got the time to do the wide reading and so on that comes with all that a deep approach entails. It's about survival. And certainly, again, in the UK, only a couple of years ago here, Steve Newstead was pointing out that much of the assessment we use in the UK is really doing very little other than actively encouraging our students to take that surface approach. And certainly, increasingly, there's very strong evidence our students become increasingly obsessed by marks and not what the marks are meant to mean or represent. They don't seem to care about what they've learnt rather than the actual marks they've been given for the piece of work that's been marked. So, again, I'd ask you to think about your courses and how true might this be for yours. The good news is that just as with a surface approach, the research suggests that there are characteristics in a course which will encourage a deep approach. Again, it's not guaranteed. Not every single student on a course like I'm going to describe now will necessarily take a deep approach, but it will certainly increase the chances. And these characteristics are these: that we engender our students with intrinsic motivation. They want to learn, basically. If we can get them wanting to learn, they're more likely to take a deep approach. And clearly we know from the literature around motivation, there are very clear links between motivation and interest and relevance. If we can make what we are doing interesting, if we can in particular make clear its relevance, why would I ever need to know this? When will I ever have to do this in the real world? If we can do those things, we are more likely to have motivated students. And that's one of our 4 vital characteristics for a deep approach. Secondly, I told you it would come back, learner activity. We need to get the students actively engaged. We should not do what I am doing now, or not too much of it, talking to you while you sit there passively, struggling to keep concentrating. That's not a good way of learning, which is why I'm going to stop talking in just 1 minute. And that links to interaction with others. It may be true that some of us are happy to sit on our own with our computer in some lonely attic somewhere. But all the evidence is that's not true for the majority. Most of us learn better through interacting with other people. And that's at least partially because we can try ideas out. We can engage in what the literature calls exploratory talk. We can test out things. We can listen to other people and maybe subtly change our view. We need activity and we need interaction. And finally, the evidence goes, we need what's called in the literature a well-structured knowledge base. What does that mean? Well, we need to see how this that we are learning now fits and links to the other things that we are learning or have learned. How does this fit into the bigger picture? And if you have a modular course, which we certainly do, it seems to me this becomes even more important, that we make clear how does this module fit with others that you've studied in the past or are possibly studying now, rather than seeing knowledge as self-contained boxes of stuff to be gathered and then moved on from. We need students to see the connections, to see how this fits the bigger picture. As I said, I'm going to stop now. What I'd like you to do with the person next to you for just about 5 minutes is to reflect how well do you think your course does on these two lists? How well do you think you're doing in encouraging a deep approach rather than a surface approach? Where may there be any problems, if any? Just for 5 minutes with somebody near you.